Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this video, we're going to talk about what is GraphQL and why we need to use it in all modern web applications. So let's take a look at what is GraphQL is. GraphQL is a syntax that describes how to ask for data, and it is generally used to load data from a server to a client. GraphQL is a query language for APIs. Basically, it is a way to get data from an API into your application. GraphQL was developed by Facebook. GraphQL has proven to be incredibly effective for building modern mobile and web applications. To understand why we need to use GraphQL, let's take a look at a very simple example. So let's compare the REST API versus GraphQL. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It is a set of rules that developers follow when they create their API. In REST APIs, you have an URL endpoint with a domain, port, path, and query string, just like this. Here you have my domain, the username is a path, and the query string, which is ID is equal to 1. Using REST API, when I make a GET request on this URL, I'm going to get the result something like this. Let's say I'm going to just make a request to the address and get the user ID. When I make this GET request, I'm going to get the result something like this. I have the user ID, street, city, and zip code. When you request for this endpoint, you will get the response back from the server. This works perfectly until you get the small amount of data as a response. What if you want just a zip code from this response? Unnecessary, you will get extra data with this response. This is what we call the overfetching. To avoid overfetching, we can use GraphQL. Using GraphQL, we can only fetch what we want. Now suppose you want the user ID 1 with a name field. Then you can just simply make a GraphQL request like this. You will have a GraphQL object, and inside it, you specify the ID 1 of the user collection. I want only the name from the user. This will return a response what I want. GraphQL will not return the unnecessary data with this response. What if I want to get just a zip code from the address? I can make a simple request for that as well. I'm going to make a GraphQL query and call the address collection with the user ID 1. This will just return the zip code from the address collection. And if later I want city as a response, I can then add a city here inside this address collection. So with GraphQL, we will get only the necessary data. This will solve the overfetching problem. GraphQL not only helps to solve overfetching problem, it also can be helpful with multiple API calls. We make the query to the user to get the user ID 1, and to get the user address, we make the query to the address collection. So we need to execute two queries to get the data from the server. But with GraphQL, you don't need to make multiple APIs call to get the data what you want. Now suppose you want the user email, zip code, and the city as a response from the server. In REST API, you have to make two API calls to get that job done. But with GraphQL, you can make a query like this. You have a GraphQL object. Inside it, you have a user collection with ID 1. Then I want email from that user collection, and I want zip and city from address collection. So I'm going to put that address here as an object. So when I execute this GraphQL query, I'm going to have the response something like this. Here you can notice I just make the one API call to get the response from two collections. This response is much better than the REST API call, isn't it? Yes, it is. GraphQL supports many languages like JavaScript, Python, PHP, Ruby, and many more. So let's take a look at how to work with GraphQL in JavaScript. So I'm going to just open the Visual Studio Code editor, and here I'm going to create an empty folder. And here I'm going to create 3 examples of GraphQL. To make you more familiar with GraphQL, I'm going to create 3 examples here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first initialize this GraphQL as npm package. I'm going to just open my terminal, and here I'm going to first enter into my GraphQL directory. So here I'm going to say cd GraphQL, and then I'm going to initialize this GraphQL folder as npm package. So I can install GraphQL inside this project. So here I'm going to say npm init to initialize this folder as npm package, and say here -y. I'm going to press enter. This will create package.json file inside this folder. You can notice here. Let me close this and clear the screen. Now once I initialize it, let me install some modules inside this project. So let me first install GraphQL. So here I'm going to say npm node package manager I for install, and I want to install GraphQL. So I'm going to say here GraphQL, and along with that I want to install nodemon. node-mon allows us to restart the server whenever we make changes inside our project files. So I'm going to use this module, and then I'm going to say --, save dev. I'm going to save these packages as dev dependencies. When I press enter, this will just install these packages in my project in the node modules folder. When I open this project, you can notice I have the node modules folder, and inside it I have both these packages. Let me clear the screen and open the package.json file. Let me just add here a start command. So down here I'm going to say comma, press enter, and in the double quote I'm going to say start, and here I'm going to say node-mon server.js. And now let me create this server.js file inside this project. But as I said earlier, I'm going to create 3 different examples. So I'm going to create here a new folder inside this GraphQL and say exp1. This is the example first, and inside it I'm going to create a new file with server.js extension. Now I'm going to just execute this file with node-mon. So here I'm going to say /exp1, and then I'm going to say server.js. So I'm going to specify the relative path of this server.js file to this node-mon module. So whenever we make any changes inside this server.js, node-mon will automatically restart the server. Let me just save the changes back to the server.js, and here I'm going to first say console.log, and I'm going to print GraphQL example1. So I'm going to save this file, open the terminal, and here I'm going to say npm start. When I press enter, this will start the server, and I'm going to have this message GraphQL example as a response. And now let me create a simple example of GraphQL here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first require the GraphQL so I can use it in this application. So I'm going to say here constant GraphQL is equal to require, and in the double quote I'm going to just require the GraphQL. So from this GraphQL module, I'm going to just require this GraphQL object, as well as I want to require the build scheme. Later I will explain what is the use of this build scheme object, but first let me require it. Here I'm going to say build scheme. Once I have both this object, let me just create my scheme. So here I'm going to say constant scheme is equal to, and call this build scheme object, and inside it I'm going to specify backtick operator, and in this backtick operator I'm going to specify my GraphQL query language. GraphQL have their own query language to fetch data from the server. Now the query language is super easy. You have the type of query, and using it you can fetch data from the server. So build scheme is used to fetch the data from the server using GraphQL. So inside this build scheme object, I'm going to specify the GraphQL query. So here I'm going to first specify the type of query. So here I'm going to say type, and it is a type of query. So here I'm going to say query. You have a type of query and mutation. We'll talk about that in the next example. But for now, let's create a simple query inside this first example. So here I'm going to say type query and specify object here. Inside this object, you specify the structure of your data. I mean, here you specify the structure of your response. So here I'm going to say foo. I'm going to create a key foo and specify type of it. I'm going to specify type string. So when I make a request to this foo key, I want the string type of data written from this key. And just after that, down here, I'm going to say constant root is equal to, and here I'm going to specify object. Inside it, I'm going to specify what type of data I want to return from this key. So inside this object, right here, I'm going to say foo, and now to this foo, I'm going to pass value. When I call this foo, I want to return a string. So here I'm going to create a function, an arrow function, and in the single quote, I'm going to say GraphQL server, like this. And down here, I'm going to say GraphQL, and in the parentheses, I'm going to first pass this scheme, this one, then I'm going to pass the data I want. So as a second argument to this GraphQL, in the single quote, as an object, I'm going to pass the data I want. Here you can notice I have here foo key, so I'm going to pass that here. And then as a third argument, I'm going to pass a root variable, this one. Just out of that, I'm going to specify here dot, then I'm going to call the promises then method, then I'm going to say here response, and I'm going to just print this response using console dot log, just like this. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just call this GraphQL object, then pass the scheme, the structure of my data. Then from the structure, I'm going to just require this foo key. And then I'm going to pass this root resolver. We'll talk about what is resolver in the next example. But for now, let's understand this resolver is going to return the data of the key. And then I'm going to pass this root as a third argument. So when I execute this example, when I save the changes, when I open the terminal, you can notice I'm going to have the result something like this. I'm going to have the data as a response. Here I have an object, and then here you can notice we have foo GraphQL server. You can notice here this statement is going to return this GraphQL server data. Now let me explain this example in more detail. What I'm going to do is, so here I just require the GraphQL and build scheme. So this statement is going to initialize this GraphQL scheme. So let me just create here a command and say initialize a GraphQL scheme. So this is the statement that describes the GraphQL shape. GraphQL query is a type of object. It means it represents some data. So here you can notice it represents this foo data of the type string. So when I make a resolver, I need to return a type of string data. Now let me just talk about what is a resolver. So here let me just create here a command and say root resolver. So what is a resolver? A resolver is a function that is responsible for populating the data for a single field in your scheme. So this is actually going to populate a data of your single field, the field you specify in the scheme. This means any field in your query object of scheme represents some kind of data. It may be object, array, or null. It could be any valid JavaScript data type. So when you save your application and open your terminal, you can notice you have a response something like this. This resolver is going to return the data from the scheme. So you have the response something like this. That's super easy, right? This is super easy to create your first GraphQL example. Now let's take a step ahead and create a simple GraphQL with Express application. So let me just copy all this code and create my next example. So here inside this GraphQL, I'm going to create a new folder, exp2, and create a server.js file inside this as well. And I'm going to paste my all code here like this. Let me close this file. Now let's integrate this with Express. Now let's take a look at how to make a GraphQL query with Express application. So let me just first back to my package.json file, and here I'm going to say server.js, but this time I'm going to execute the server from the example 2. Save this file, back to the server.js, and right from here, instead of this GraphQL, I'm going to use GraphQL Express module. So I'm going to get rid of this GraphQL like this, open the terminal, open a new terminal, and first enter into my directory GraphQL, and here I'm going to say npm I for install the Express module, as well as I'm going to say Express GraphQL, and I want to install this as dev dependency. So here I'm going to say save dev. When I press enter, I'm going to have both these modules inside this node modules folder. Let me just back to my first bash shell, close this terminal. Let me just edit this example. So as you know, I'm going to use this build scheme to create GraphQL query. So at the top, I'm going to first create the Express application. So I'm going to say here Express, constant Express is equal to require, and I'm going to require the Express. Just out of that, I'm going to say constant GraphQL HTTP, and I'm going to just require Express GraphQL. So from the Express GraphQL, I'm going to require the GraphQL HTTP. Just out of that, I'm going to leave this scheme as it is. I'm going to just change this foo to boo, and then I'm going to just make a resolver, and I'm going to just change this GraphQL server to Express GraphQL server, and instead of this GraphQL scheme, here I'm going to say constant app is equal to Express. So I'm going to just create Express application, and I'm going to say app.use, and using this method I'm going to call the middleware. So in the single code, I'm going to say here GraphQL, specify comma here, and say GraphQL HTTP, and in the parentheses as an object I'm going to pass my scheme I'm going to pass my scheme variable, this one, and then I'm going to pass my root resolver as a second argument. So I'm going to specify here comma, and down here I'm going to say root value, and I'm going to specify here root resolver. And just after that, down here I'm going to say app.listen, and I want to listen this application on port 4000. And when I listen this application, I want to print a console message. So as a callback, I'm going to say console.log GraphQL is running on HTTP localhost 4000, and then I'm going to pass this GraphQL path, right, like this. Specify semicolon, save this file. Let me just open my terminal and restart it, and restart the node module. So I'm going to say here npm start. Oops, I think I misspelled something here. GraphQL HTTP is not a function. Let me just check my code. Yeah, right here. I just forgot to add curly braces here. Open my terminal, and now let me just save the changes. I'm going to have a response. GraphQL is running on HTTP localhost 4000, and here is the path of your GraphQL server. So now I'm going to just make a query to this GraphQL server and get the response from this server. So now let me show you how you can get the response from this GraphQL server. I'm using Postman API tool to test this GraphQL query. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply open the Postman. So I'm going to just open the Postman API testing tool to test this API. So I'm going to just make a GraphQL query using this API testing tool. Before I test it, you can notice here in the resolver we have foo as a response. You can notice in the scheme we specify boo. So let me just change this and specify here boo. So when I make a request to this boo, I want to get this resolver. Save this file, back to the Postman API testing tool, open a new tab, and here I'm going to just first select the get request, and I'm going to say here HTTP localhost 4000 /GraphQL. Then I'm going to select this body and select this GraphQL, and here I'm going to make a GraphQL request. So in the object like this, I'm going to just call boo like this. When I make a request, I'm going to have my data what I want. So as you can notice, this is super easy to get your data using the GraphQL server. You can notice in this example, we have done the same thing with Express GraphQL module. Now let's take a step ahead where we're going to have the Apollo server to create the GraphQL scheme, and we're going to make a relationship with the data we use. Next, I'm going to show you how you can create the real world GraphQL example. So let's see how to do it. Now let's take a step ahead and create a real world GraphQL example. Let me just close the server.js, close this example too, and create a new folder here with exp. This is the third example. So I'm going to say here exp3, and here I'm going to create server.js file. And don't forget to specify that file here. So I'm going to specify example3, save this file, open the server.js, open the terminal, stop this execution, clear the screen, and say npm start again to start this third example server.js file. Let me just close this terminal, and here I'm going to first require the Apollo server module. So let me first open the terminal and install that module using my second bash shell. So here I'm going to say npm I for install, and I'm going to say Apollo server and specify -- save dev. I'm going to install this Apollo server as a dev dependency. This will just install this Apollo server module inside the node modules folder of this project. Now once I've done that, let me just back to my first bash shell, close this terminal, and up here I'm going to say constant in the curly braces. I'm going to first require the Apollo server, as well as I'm going to just require the GraphQL, and I'm going to just specify equal to sign require, and in the single quote I'm going to say Apollo server. So from this Apollo server module, I'm going to require the Apollo server and the GQL object. Apollo server is the best way to build a production ready self-documenting GraphQL API that can use data from any source. So this is the best way to create your GraphQL server. So I'm going to require this module, and just after that I'm going to just add my data. So I'm going to just create here an array and specify data inside it. So here I'm going to add my data. In this data I have post and authors. Inside this post I have a type of array, and in this array I have a type of object, and inside this object I have post ID and the title. We have two posts inside this array, and then we have the authors or the type array, and inside this array I have object. Inside the object I have the author ID, the post ID, and the name of the author. You can notice the author and the post have relation with this post ID field. I'm going to show you how you can use this field to display data in GraphQL. I'm going to leave this data as it is inside this file, and down here I'm going to just add a GraphQL scheme. So I'm going to say here constant scheme is equal to, and then I'm going to specify here GQL, the GraphQL query. So as you can notice, I'm going to use this object here. This object is going to help us to create GraphQL scheme. Now just for that I'm going to specify backtick operator like this, and inside it I'm going to specify the GraphQL scheme. So here I'm going to first specify the type, which is query, and here I'm going to say post, and it is a type of array, so I'm going to specify square bracket and say post. Then specify comma here and say author, and this is also a type of array, so here I'm going to say author like this, and just down here I'm going to specify the shape of this type post and type author. In GraphQL you could have your own type of scheme. So when you make a request to this post, I'm going to just return the data of type post, and when you make a request to this author, I'm going to just return a data of type author. So this is a custom type. You can easily create your custom types in GraphQL. Let me show you how. So this is my custom post type. Let me create this post type down here. I'm going to say here type, and this is the type of post. So here I'm going to say post and then specify curly braces. That's it. This will create a type of post. So when you make a request to this post, this will return the shape of this post object. Now inside this type, I'm going to first specify ID. It is type of integer, so I'm going to say here int. Then I'm going to specify title. It is a type of string. So as you can notice, I'm going to just return the ID and the title of the post. I'm going to specify the shape of my data to this GraphQL scheme. Just out of that, let me specify the shape of this author as well. So down here I'm going to say type author. In the object I'm going to specify ID. It is a type of integer. Then specify post ID, and it is a type of integer as well, and specify name, and this is a type of string. You can notice here the name is a type of string, post ID is a type of integer, and ID is a type of integer. So I'm going to specify the shape of my data here like this, and just down here don't forget to specify here semicolon, and just out of that I'm going to just make here a root resolver. So to create a root resolver, I'm going to say here constant root resolver variable, and to this root resolver I'm going to pass an object like this, and now I'm going to make here a query. So I'm going to add here a query like this, specify colon and specify object here. Now because I'm using Apollo server, it's super easy to create a root resolver. I'm going to just make a query, and inside this query I'm going to create a post function like this and return post object. So I'm going to just return this data in this root resolver. Just out of that, down here I'm going to call the Apollo server. So down here I'm going to say constant server is equal to new Apollo server in the parentheses in the object, and here I'm going to specify the type defs, which is the scheme, and the second argument is going to be resolver. So here I'm going to specify root resolver. The first parameter is a type defs. Here I'm going to specify the scheme, and then I'm going to specify the root resolver to this property resolver. Just out of that, I'm going to just start this server. So I'm going to say here server dot listen, and then specify here port 4000, call the then method. Because Apollo server use promises, so in the listen method I'm going to pass the curly braces, then specify the port 4000, and using this then method here I'm going to say URL and return console.log. In the backtick operator I'm going to say server ready on, and I'm going to print this URL variable here. Oops, I misspelled here. I need to wrap these curly braces in the parentheses like this. Let me just save the changes. Open the terminal. When you save the changes, you will have the response something like this. The server ready on HTTP localhost 4000. Now I'm using Apollo server, so I don't need to use API testing tool to test this GraphQL query. When you open your terminal, just click on this link. When you click on it, this will open the Apollo server for testing your GraphQL query. So when you click on it, you can notice this will open a GraphQL on localhost 4000, and here you can test your GraphQL query. Let me show you how. I'm going to say here query, and inside this query, as you know, I have post, and in this post I want ID, so I'm going to say here ID and click on this execute query button. When I click on it, I'm going to have the response something like this. Let me just zoom this a little bit, and now if I want to get the title as well, I'm going to specify here comma and say title. When I click on this execute query, I'm going to have the title as a response from this data. So you can notice the query is returning the data what you want. You will not get the unnecessary data with the request. So to make a GraphQL query, I'm going to just specify here query, and in the object, I'm going to pass my post object with the fields. I have ID and title field to this post, so I'm going to specify that here. Now if I want to just get the title, I'm going to get rid of this ID from here and make a query. When I make it, you can notice the ID is removed from this result, and I'm going to have the title as a response. That's super easy, right? You will get the data of what you need. Just after that, let me show you how to get the data of these authors. So as you know, I have this shape of the author inside this GraphQL scheme. So down here, let me just add author here as well. Specify comma and say author. I'm going to just create a function here of the type author and just return author like this. I'm going to just return this author object. Open your Apollo server, and now let me just get the author data. So down here, I'm going to say author, and from the author, I want author name. So I'm going to specify here name, and when I click on this execute query, you can notice I'm going to have the author data as well as a response. So this is super easy to get the data using GraphQL. Now what I want to make a relationship between this post and this author. So let me show you how you can do it. I'm going to just back to my example, and down here, just out of this query, I'm going to specify comma here and specify a type of post, and here I'm going to specify curly braces, and just out of that I'm going to say author. Then here I'm going to pass an argument parent, and in the curly braces in this function I'm going to just return authors dot filter. Using this filter method, I'm going to filter the author according to the post ID. So I'm going to say here author. I'm going to call a callback function here of filter and say here author dot post ID is equal to parent dot ID. So I'm going to use this parent argument to access this post type. So I'm going to just get the ID from this post using this parent dot ID and compare that with the author post ID. So what I'm going to do is, to this post, I'm going to add another field of the type author. You can notice here we have the author function, so I'm going to pass here author, and this is a type of array of author. So I'm going to pass this author here. So I'm going to just say here author, and I'm going to just filter this author using this parent argument. Let me save this file, and instead of specifying this object outside of this post, I'm going to get rid of this object right from here, and inside this post I can specify here author and then specify here name. When I execute this query, you can notice here I have post, the title of the post, and the author of this post. So this is super easy to filter your data using GraphQL. Now once you understand how to get the data, let me show you how you can make a post request using GraphQL. This is a type of GET request. You make a GET request to this post and get the result what you want. Let me show you how you can make a post request using GraphQL. GraphQL uses mutation to create a post request. Let me show you. So I'm going to just make a post request inside this scheme. So inside this scheme, I'm going to first specify the shape of the scheme. So down here, I'm going to say here type, mutation. So I'm going to say here mutation. In GraphQL, if you want to make a post request, you need to specify the type mutation. Just for that, I'm going to get rid of this statement, and inside this mutation, I'm going to say create post, and in the parentheses, I'm going to specify ID. It is a type of integer, and title, it is a type of string. And this post create is going to return a type of post data, this one. Let me save the changes, and just down here, just out of this query, right down here, I'm going to add mutation. So here I'm going to just add mutation, then specify colon, curly braces, and say here create post, and this is a type of function. So I'm going to pass here parentheses. In the GraphQL, you have mutation with 4 arguments. First is a parent, second is argument, third is a context, and fourth is a info. So I'm going to just leave the first argument of parent. So I'm going to specify here underscore like this. The first argument is a value of the resolver for this field parent. We're not going to learn how to use this first argument, so I'm going to leave this as it is. Just for now, I'm going to leave this argument as it is, specify here comma, and then as a second argument, I'm going to specify args. And then in the curly braces, I'm going to say return. In the object, I want to return ID, so I'm going to say argument args dot ID, and then title args dot title. I think I misspelled here an arrow like this. That's it, and get rid of this query. And now I'm not going to make a get request, I'm making the post request. So I'm going to start with mutation like this, and in the mutation, as you know, I'm going to just create a post. So I'm going to use this function. So here I'm going to say create post, and to this parameter I'm going to specify values. So here I'm going to first specify ID. ID is going to be 3, and then title. In the double quote, I'm going to specify title mutation, and just after that, here I'm going to specify curly braces. So if I want to get the data from this post, I can specify here ID, as well as I can specify here title. So when I make this mutation request, I want to get this data. For now, let me get rid of this ID and make this request. When I click on this, execute query. So you can notice how easy it is to create a GraphQL query. GraphQL is a glue between your API and your client application. GraphQL is super easy and makes your modern application more easy to understand and create. Don't worry, I will make a complete project using GraphQL, so you will completely understand how to work with GraphQL. So I hope you get the basic understanding of GraphQL. Like this video if you find anything useful. Subscribe for more latest videos of programming. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.